Asbestos-related deaths, I'm sure you're all familiar with. This is a typical example of a gentleman sawing up chunks of asbestos, and if you look at the all the dust that he's got on him, you can only imagine the levels of asbestos he's being exposed to. So if you're looking at asbestos exposure mortality, it's a fairly typical case. You can see how over the 1930s we had a peak in its use, and then it dropped down until it started being used more as a kind of wonder material, particularly in building industries around the 50s, and again in the 60s. The exposure in the 1930s is likely partially due to construction, but also due to its use in automotive functions. And then, as you see, it starts to get used heavily in construction. We start importing huge amounts of it, and then we've got this drop off as people start to become more aware of the health impacts from it. However, what's this rather frightening to contemplate is if we have our peak exposure in the 1960s, 70s, then we've got this lag factor to come in for our long-term health impacts before our mortality occurs. And so over time, you can see as we come from 2010 through to 2030, it's over this period we're going to be looking at the highest levels of mortality, not whilst the exposures are occurring. Now, if you think about it, this is never going to tail off to nothing, because we have a large amount of asbestos which is in all of our buildings. Only ones built post around the sort of mid-90s onwards, you can be fairly sure are not going to contain asbestos, but even then you still can't be 100% sure. And so workmen working in these buildings, or persons working in these buildings, excuse me, they are going to be disturbing this asbestos as they drill through walls and refurbish them. And so it is the trades that are going to be suffering, and so it will drop, but it will never get down to zero. So again, you can find out some of this is sort of the information that's been found out through these epidemiological studies looking at the rates of disease and possible causative factors. So we've got smoking status here, and if you think about relative risk, any ratio of relative risk greater than 1 indicates that you've got a significant increase in the severity of your hazard. So severity of risk from your hazard. So as you see here, good examples are duration of exposure. As the duration of exposure goes up, then the relative risk of asbestosis goes up dramatically. A relative risk of 1 here, which is a great increase. Latency, so over time you can see how these health impacts are coming out. Job type, insulation, you can see he was using a lot of friable loose asbestos, a lot of fibers in the air, and so this group are the most at risk. However, asbestos removal contractors are not in a brilliant position. In fact, if you look at this and you consider the latency, then probably the best thing you could do would be to employ lots of removal contractors who are coming very close to retirement. So I kid. So you see here how the levels of this dropped off over time as asbestos use has started to reduce. And so from this sort of information we can help to characterize the risk. So again, this is just another picture of you see this asbestos imports and its consumption, and then you can see this lag, and you can see the rates of mesothelioma starting to climb, and interestingly asbestosis rates climbing, but a lot slower.